Welcome back, everyone. If you don't already know, I'm Chelsea Joe from Nomadic Ambitions, and this is part 2 of the Nimbus 2000 tutorial. Today, we're going to talk about routing and shaping. So let's go.
So, materials for part 2. You will need a router and a 3/4 round over bit, belt sander if you want, hand sander and all the grits. I'm talking 60, 80, 120, 220, 400, 500, wood filler of some kind, and personal protective equipment. This is the most tedious part of the entire build. I'm talking initially this took me like 8 hours tedious, but it's the most rewarding part of the whole build. If there's one thing I had to ask of you, it is please, for the love of God, use a routing table. While it is possible using the router freehand, it's probably not the best idea for this. As it starts to round over, you're going to lose all the flat surface you need to hold the piece stable. Routers are really aggressive, so please just be careful. Routing is a pretty straightforward concept, just like a bandsaw. Just turn on the router and glide it in a straight line. We were a bit confined with space, so some cuts got stopped and picked back up, but it still worked out just fine. Make sure you do every single side and don't be afraid of the router taking off too much. This is why we put our pattern in the middle of the board. Now, remember how I said knots are going to make things more difficult? Yeah, here we are. Sometimes it can't be avoided, but there's an easy workaround. Grab some wood filler of any brand. It doesn't really matter what. I've known people to inject resin into the knot with a syringe, so it really doesn't matter what you use, especially since it's not even going to be noticeable after you stain. This particular filler that I'm using is a 1-to-1 ratio, so you just mix and wait for it to dry. Once it's dry, sand it off, and you're done. Once you're done, if you want, take it to a belt sander and clean up any waves from the bandsaw cuts or tears. I stopped using the sanding belt because I personally didn't feel like I could see what I was doing, but that could just be a me thing. So if it's easier on you to use it, go for it. Alright, next is what I like to call shoulder murder. No, seriously, you're going to be sanding for a while. This is easiest to do with a 60 or 80 grit. They're the most aggressive and they'll get the job done just a little bit faster. I started with the 2 faces first and then went to shaping. In the parts where you see me touching the wood, I'm checking to make sure it's level, not that it's smooth. When you cut wood as thick as this, if you stop a cut on the bandsaw and don't meet up with that line again, there's going to be a jump in the wood. And you can kind of see that here. So before you start rounding the edges over, make sure it's all level. Okay, let's talk shaping. As a refresher, this is what the handle looks like before routing. And this is the top after routing. And it's nearly perfect. But this is the core after routing. And yes, while those edges are rounded over, it's still very blocky looking. I know someone is going to ask, well, why not use a bigger roundover bit? And the answer is simply, the next size up just takes too much off. And I didn't want the Nimbus to be completely round. I wanted it to be rounded over. Not to mention that replicating this identically like the movie prop was beyond my comprehension as a beginner woodworker. The actual prop is completely rounded at the bottom, with this weird squared side cut and a really deep undercut. And I knew that getting that 100% identical look would be way more physically intensive than I could handle. So I did my own thing. Getting back to business though, each side needs to be ground down. But there's a really fine line you walk to get a rounded over look versus a completely round look. The best way I can explain this is your sanding needs to be like a windshield wiper, or else one side is going to be deeper than the other and not completely evenly rounded over. Don't just hang with the sander on one side to grind it down, because the chances of you replicating the depth on the other side is really slim. It's just easier to be consistently oscillating what you're doing. Once you have that rounded over look you want, go through all the grits. Whether you started with a 60 or an 80, your numbers need to go up consecutively. So 120, 220, 400, 500. Don't go straight from an 80 to a 500 or an 80 to a 220. When I first made the Nimbus 2000, I didn't realize the importance of going through the grits. And while it is tedious, it's really important to do. Going through the grits in the proper order will get the core super, super smooth, like butter. And this is what you want. So if you sanded till your arms fell off, you should have something that looks like this. Let's take a quick look back at what we started with. Ew, look at that square block. But look at what you are going home with. That is a beautifully rounded over piece of wood. But, I'm biased. Well, guys, that's it for part 2. Next up is staining and core construction. I'll see you guys soon.